Welcome everybody to the Be the Voice webinar. This is part of Save the Children's continuous advocacy and campaign capacity building work that's linked to our Open University and Save the Children course that you can find on OneNet. Today I'm really excited to introduce Helen Morton. She is Save the Children's Post-2015 lead. She's based in Save UK in London. She spent the past decade in international development, most recently as head of global advocacy, the INGO Practical Action. Helen has spent the past 10 months providing strategic direction for Save the Children's post-2015 engagement. In practice, her role is split between high-level representation, providing steers for the global SCI post-2015 working group, and offering strategic support on capital-level advocacy. No small job there, Helen. It seems like you have your plate full.
It's my dream job, so yeah, pretty fortunate.
Thank you so much for the time today, and hopefully as listeners join us in this call, they'll be able to interact with us. Please feel free to type any questions that you may have. If people have any problems hearing, please just redial into the call. Sometimes that helps solve the problem. For everybody listening, this recording will be available on the OneNet page. You should be able to access it. If you'd like to listen to a recording or share it with your colleagues, if it's been helpful, we hope it is. Great, so we're going to kick this off. Helen, post-2015, where do we start? So you want to give us a little bit of context background to what we're talking about here?
So in terms of context and background that's useful for those listening and watching, there's probably two aspects to cover off. One is to give you a sense of kind of what the potential of the post-2015 framework looks like and why it is that Save the Children has so actively and intensely engaged with the process and the politics. And the other is maybe to give you a bit of a flavour of really what that Save the Children engagement has looked like. For Save the Children, the post-2015 framework looks and feels like something that can redefine what development looks like for the next 15 years and beyond. When we think about the post-2015 framework, we don't just think about the content, we also think about the politics. And we really don't just focus down on the declaration that's going to be declared in September of this year. We really focus on what that looks like in terms of delivery for the communities that matter to us in 2030. It's a 15-year framework. Save the Children has been engaged with the post-2015 process for pretty much since its beginning. So for those that don't know, the post-2015 process is now really ramping up. So we're going, last month we just started with the formal intergovernmental negotiations on post-2015. But in fact, the work for the international community, both member states and civil society and private sector, actually started back in June 2012 with the Rio +20 conference. That set out the mandate for what was called an open working group of 70 member states to work together to try and establish what the successor goals to the Millennium Development Goals might look like, which at the moment are called Sustainable Development Goals. We hear from the Secretary General that they might get renamed, but let's see what that looks like in September. So over the course of the past 2 years or so, there's been a whole host of different inputs into the post-2015 process. The most significant and the one that's really had traction is the open working group that I just mentioned. And through that process, last July, after 15 months of intensive work in New York, member states were able to put forward a proposal of 17 goals and 169 targets. That's significantly different from the Millennium Development Goals that we know and mostly love, where we had 8 goals and 21 targets. So both in terms of scope and content, in terms of political buy-in and civil society participation, the Sustainable Development Goals and the Millennium Development Goals look and feel quite different already.
Helen, sorry, just to interrupt you there. That seems like a lot. 17 goals, 169 targets. I mean, what is the distinction between the Millennium Development Goals? And I'm sure you're about to go on and tell us this. But, you know, we had 8 very specific goals, very specific targets. What are really the lessons that we learned from the MDGs? And are these Sustainable Development Goals just another collection of targets that are made up in New York that countries are going to have to just implement without any input or say? Just give us a little bit of context to kind of, are we going in the right direction? Are we happy with the direction that it's going?
Sure, very happy to answer that question, because it's the question that we as Save the Children are thinking about on a pretty much daily basis. I think the somewhat sad and challenging news is that the vast majority of member states and the vast majority of NGOs have almost resigned themselves that they're going to preserve the 17 goals and the 169 targets. That's a real challenge, because we believe that part of the success of the MDGs was that really causal link between their focus, the 8 goals, and their ability to deliver, because they were able to harness political will, drive and channel funding, and help to ensure that, you know, for all its faults in terms of monitoring, the Millennium Development Goals, at least we were clear in terms of what the big headlines were. One of the challenges that we have with the Sustainable Development Goals is their breadth. And when we look at the 17 goals, in some ways it's more of a shopping list than an action plan. There's nothing that isn't included there, and in a positive way you could say that that really reflects the complexity of the world that we live in, and it reflects the fact that the process was open and consultative. So, you know, you had 70 member states, albeit not the 193, in New York, able to put forward on the table what was a priority for them. And a really tangible example of that is you would have, for example, a representative of the government of Nepal coming from Kathmandu, and their success indicator for the SDGs is to ensure that there's really strong language on mountain biodiversity. And they were able to return to Kathmandu feeling successful because that's in there, but everything is in there. And from Save the Children's perspective, what is required now is we really need to focus on kind of improving the framework. What we've got at the moment is a framework that we believe will be really challenging to implement. We want to see, our big success indicator really is a post-2015 framework that is ambitious, equitable and implementable and leaves no one behind. And we're not convinced that we're there yet. Politics aren't in our favour, the direction of travel isn't in our favour. And when we're working with member states right the way across the political spectrum, we have to be mindful that this is a very political issue. They don't want to see this reopened, but we are doing what we can to make sure that the targets, for example, are evidence-based, can be implemented, can be monitored, and can be delivered for the most vulnerable communities, including children.
So, Helen, now that biodiversity target, I'm bringing you back to some of the really kind of tangible, like how is this actually going to work in reality? And then I'd like to go back to the political discussion. So what happens if a country doesn't have the needs that Nepal does on the biodiversity? They get to pick and choose which of those goals are applicable to them, and is there a sense of accountability to a global platform that we had at the MDGs in this SDGs, or is it, as you said, a shopping list and they get to pick and choose? How does that work?
Well, again, a really great question. One of the really standout, something that really makes the SDGs stand out is that for the first time in the history of the UN, we have a development framework that's supposed to be universal. So the premise behind the Sustainable Development Goals that makes them very different to the Millennium Development Goals is this isn't a list of aspirations for developing countries. This is a list of aspirations, in theory, for every country of the world and hopefully every citizen within every country of the world. The problem that we've got there is exactly what you pointed to. It totally jars with the reality of having such a long list of goals and targets. We're really mindful that, for example, there's a standalone goal on oceans. What happens if you're a landlocked African country? How is that applicable to you? How do we ensure that the goals and targets that will have the greatest impact in terms of challenging inequality, ending extreme poverty, and really shifting the dial in terms of the issues that matter to Save the Children, for example, how do we make sure that they are prioritised right the way across the set of countries? And your point there on accountability links really closely. What we're finding is that now there is quite a significant pushback from a number of member states around the language of accountability. We want to make sure, yes, it's a voluntary framework, but we really want to ensure that this is something that can be implemented in its entirety in every country for every citizen. And the challenge that we will find, no doubt, is there's already pushback on the language of accountability. member states instead, particularly the G77, are pushing for this to be called a review and monitoring mechanism. And there's no real clarity yet in terms of what that looks like. Save the Children has a perspective in terms of the hurdles that we want for that mechanism to cross. But it's a really interesting point, you know, if member states want to see this breadth of an agenda, including everything, how do we ensure that that's delivered upon? It will be very difficult. We know it was challenging with 8 goals, so 17 goals will make for a very different scenario.
Absolutely, Helen. It sounds like there's a lot of work to be done, especially with countries themselves. And I'd like to turn to any of our listeners. If they have any thoughts, feel free to unmute your mic or to type in the text section of this LinkedIn. If you've got any questions that you have for Helen, or even examples of how this is playing out in your country, how is civil society engaging, how is Save the Children engaging? Now, Helen, I know we've been working on this globally. I mean, this is not something that's just happening in New York or in the UK. Can you tell us a little bit about the work that's happening in our countries that's looking at this post-2015 framework and some of the roles that Save the Children and perhaps our partners have played in these discussions?
Absolutely. I want to just say at this juncture, I think Save the Children, and I would say I don't think I've been with Save the Children long enough to be biased, but I think we're adding really significant value on post-2015 from a couple of perspectives. Yes, we're producing that really kind of sector-leading, thought-leading global policy publication or a briefing for each of the negotiation sessions in New York. But where I actually think we're adding more value is at capital level in the countries that we operate in. One of the things that we're really conscious of and we're trying to make sure happens sooner rather than later is trying to engage the decision makers at national level to think about what the reality of implementing this huge agenda will look like. So, for example, it's really great to see Kadri on the call today. We've been doing a huge amount of work with Arshad and the team in Pakistan to really think through, you know, for Pakistan, what will it look like come January 2016 to be implementing this agenda? What changes might the government of Pakistan need and want to make in terms of financing, planning, capacity, participation, to try and ensure that this is a framework that works for them? So we've really been majoring on both influencing the conversations that are happening at capital level before the declaration of the agenda, and trying to encourage those that are based at capital level and country level to think through what will happen after the declaration of the agenda. How can we make this a framework that works for each government, but more importantly, works for each citizen?
Great. I mean, that's a really huge amount of work, and it sounds like it's not going to be ending anytime soon. So our post-2015 work, I'm sure, is going to end up going definitely beyond 2015. Talk to us a little bit. I'm sure a lot of the staff in Save the Children have heard this, and a lot of people in civil society, the work around Action 2015. And how is that linked to this? Explain what is Action 2015 doing? What are we doing with this post-2015? What are the linkages? And what are we trying to achieve there?
Sure. Great question. Action 2015 plays a really different but kind of mutually reinforcing role for our post-2015 advocacy. As I'm sure those of you on the call know, the role that Save the Children often plays in terms of advocacy is somewhat of a kind of insider or a kind of resource for member states and government. And it often means that when you're in that position, you play a very different role. So there are things that we can do to have influence from an advocacy perspective, and there are things that we can do to have influence from a campaigns perspective. And really the distinction between Action 2015 and our post-2015 advocacy is that Action 2015 focuses on the popular mobilisation. So Action 2015 is trying to work to a really big picture objective, which is that we have an ambitious post-2015 framework that really shifts the dial on poverty, inequality and climate change. But other than that, it's really about mobilising the public and trying to have them mobilise the conversation further and higher. So one of the issues that we think we have at the moment is there really isn't much buy-in for the post-2015 process outside of New York and outside of a kind of diplomat level. We want to ensure that Post-2015 is felt in the hearts and heads of the general public, and then use the general public to ensure that they feel that they can apply the pressure to heads of state to ensure that they really bring that political will and political buy-in to ensure that this is a framework that, you know, is actively implemented rather than something that people remember 2 or 3 tenets from some way down the line. So Action 2015 is the popular mobilisation, the creative, grassroots, it might be more media-facing, more public-facing piece of work. And then the majority of the work that we're doing both in New York and across our key capitals is much more that kind of insider advocacy. It will be more content-specific. It will be more mindful of the politics and, you know, where member states are aligning themselves, less that kind of cut-through big-picture message on ambition and more about what we really want to see that framework deliver. Having said that, they reinforce one another, and the joy of Action 2015 that we're already seeing is that it's really amplifying the post-2015 advocacy work we're doing. They can bring the numbers together, they can push major digital actions across over 100 countries, and we don't have the capacity or necessarily the skill set to be able to do that as post-2015 advocates.
So many of our countries are actually engaging in both of those, the campaigning side of it and the advocacy side of it. And I suppose, you know, part of it is addressing, I remember what we had with the Millennium Development Goals, where many people just didn't even know what they were. And so, you know, when you spoke about a country achieving its MDGs, you would often be faced with blank stares from the public that you were hoping was benefiting from these actions. So I'd like to bring it back to the children.
Yes.
Now, in this framework, what are we seeing in terms of goals, targets, and principles within that framework that has the potential to change the lives of children? What is the specificity that Save the Children, I know, is going to be focusing on for the next, 15 years moving forward? What can we really take home from there?
Sure, great question. So the good news is, within those 17 goals, that are locked in, the issues that traditionally are at the forefront of Save the Children's priority areas, be that education, be that health, be that poverty reduction, are pretty much firm, and they're very central. So when we think about the 17 goals, if they were to be reopened and re-examined and some were to be removed, we can pretty much guarantee that the human development oriented goals, so if you've had a chance to look at the goals, that would be kind of goals 1 through to 6, are very safe. Not to say that we don't want to nuance some of the language and some of the targets and commitments there, but certainly those issues are central to the agenda. There are some issues that are very pertinent to child development and child rights that are slightly more at risk. At the moment, there is a target in terms of ending violence against children, which is fantastic, and that's a major advocacy success for Save the Children and our child-focused agency colleagues. But it is at risk because it sits within the most contentious goal, which is a goal on governance and peaceful and stable societies. And if there is a reopening of the framework, that is a goal that's likely to be lost, or most at risk of being lost. And with it then the question of where is that kind of key child protection and violence against children target going to live. But I would say the most significant commitment that we could see captured and embedded in the post-2015 framework in September that could have a huge impact on the lives of children and all vulnerable and marginalised groups is something that's called, and bear with me because it sounds quite complicated, no target met unless met for all social and economic groups. So I'll rewind a little bit. Lots of member states have been talking about one of the real standout achievements of this new framework is that it could leave no one behind. For the first time, when we get to 2030, we could say nobody was left behind from development progress and our path to sustainable development.
So we're moving beyond the MDGs where we had averages, we had an 80% target. So we're now saying everybody. It's not just 80%, because what we saw, and your insights would be fantastic on this, is with those, many of the countries were achieving the targets, but the most marginalized, often children, were the ones that fell into that group of, oh, well, you know, we met our target, so we're job done.
Yeah.
So you're telling me we've had success there. We're seeing universality. We're seeing a zero. Everybody needs to be included in this. How realistic is that, Helen?
Oh, I mean, it's a challenge for us. There are a few different approaches. We, as Save the Children, there are very tangible, concrete targets that we want to see locked into the agenda. And actually, we're really quite happy that our core priority issues are embedded. But there's also a kind of principle and political will piece, which is if we allow ourselves to get to September and not have this commitment that no one should be left behind in the agenda, then we've really missed an opportunity to change a generation. And your point, Shawnee, was really important, I think. You know, we've seen a lot of traction for what we would call zero goals. Save the Children has been advocating for these throughout the post-2015 process. So as you say, this is about, for the first time ever, ending, so getting to zero on extreme poverty. Could we have believed that would be the case? Do we think it's possible? These are all the questions that we need to be asking. But certainly as the document stands right now, we are aiming to get to zero on extreme poverty by 2030. Not all of the targets or all of the goals are trying to get to zero, but what we are saying is that we want to see a framework where no target can be considered met by 2030 unless every child or every social or economic group has been able to meet it. So whether you're in an urban location or a rural location, whether you're a boy or a girl, whether you're from the wealthiest quintile or the poorest quintile, you should be able to have that sense that you're going to be given the chance to achieve the same targets as those who might happen to have been born in a more privileged situation. So whether it's achievable or not, I think is a major question, and certainly some of the research that we've done has really indicated that we will require a major step change to get to that scenario. But certainly in terms of it being a guiding principle and something that could be a real legacy point for the post-2015 framework, we want to ensure that we leave no one behind, and that's at the heart of Save the Children's advocacy message.
And that ambition is fantastic, and I think it would be absolutely game-changing to the world to have that. Tell us about the politics and the process. What are we looking at here? What's happening in the next couple months up until September, or even actually until the end of the year? What are the priority moments? What should we be watching? What are the expectations of engagement for Save the Children and civil society?
Yeah. So the process is really quite firmly set. So for any of you that are interested, I can certainly share that with you. In New York, we've got 8 negotiation rounds through to the end of July. And each month they'll be focusing on a different subject matter. So last month, for the first time, the 193 states came together and they called it stock taking. You know, let's take stock of what we've achieved to date. What do we need to improve upon? Where do we need to change? In February, they're focusing on the declaration, which will sit on top of the goals and targets that are launched in September. In terms of key moments throughout that process, I'd say there are maybe 3. March will be a really significant month. The negotiations in March are focused around goals and targets. That'll be a really significant opportunity and potentially kind of point of jeopardy, where member states may step forward and say, we've done a fabulous job to date, we have everything captured on the page, but perhaps we need to think realistically now in terms of the priorities and the political salience of this framework. Or they may not, they might continue to preserve what's down on paper and maintain a political balance. So March will be a significant moment for us on Post-2015. Another major moment will be the end of May. At the end of May, we're expecting the release of what we call a zero draft, and that's basically the document that will be launched in September at the Heads of State Summit. And then the negotiations change. It becomes what they call line-by-line negotiations. So they literally will go through each word. And, for example, Guatemala may say, we'd like to change that word from enhance to improve. And Bangladesh may say, actually, we think it was better as enhanced. So you then go through this very heavy-duty wordsmithing process. The reason that's important for us as Save the Children and as civil society is that it's likely that our access and ability to participate from that point will become much more difficult. And linked to that, in terms of content, if you don't see it in the zero draft, it's going to be very, very difficult to try and get your issue into the goals and targets in the post-2015 framework after May. We also think that kind of couple of months from the end of May, when the zero draft is released, through to the end of July, when it supposedly will be completed, will be a very kind of heavily political period. During that period, we've also got the G7 meeting in Germany, which is another kind of staging post on the way to seeing the post-2015 framework launched in September. And we've also got the Financing for Development Summit in Ethiopia, which is happening before the Sustainable Development Goals are announced, and is intended really to provide some degree of confidence and clarity in terms of how we might fund this huge agenda. So I'd say that quarter from kind of June through to end of September, when the post-2015 framework is launched, is going to be one of high intensive activity. And I'd really encourage anyone on the call, just as I would with those of us that are active on the Save the Children Post-2015 working group, to think about how you might engage as a citizen, as a member of a civil society organisation, how you might try and engage your government and your community to really focus on what this could mean for you in terms of development over the next 15 years and for the coming generation.
So, Helen, a question on that. What has been some of the most successful strategies and tactics that our staff have had to influence some of these things? I mean, we're saying we want you to engage, but really, what is the very tangible things that they should be looking at? Is this about meeting with ministries of health? Is this about meeting with ministries of foreign affairs? Who should they be, what are some of the lessons we've learned in this process?
Sure, great question. Well, I would say as a first step, it's about getting informed. So this is a highly political, really nuanced process. So one invitation I'd like to share with the group and anyone that's watching subsequently is we have a post-2015 working group. We're very active. We have about 100 members and about 30 very, very active members. So that's your opportunity to gen up on post-2015 in terms of politics, content, what it might look and feel like at your country level. So I think the first step is to get informed. And then the second step, as you say, is really to get engaged. Now, as Save the Children, we have a really coordinated programme of outreach and action with our member states. So, for example, this week, each one of the countries that's involved with our post-2015 advocacy is outreaching to their Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And as you were saying, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs really are the key contact point in the majority of countries on post-2015, to schedule a meeting with them for late this week, early next week, to present our recommendations for the negotiation session that's happening in 3 weeks' time. So we have a really coordinated programme of action. But in addition to that, there are lots of other tactics that we're using. So as I was saying earlier, Save the Children is known as a real kind of trusted broker by a lot of member states, as a resource, as a kind of insider expert. But we're also really keen to play a role as a kind of capacity builder and kind of broker for civil society. So we're also using things like global civil society mobilization letters. We're launching one, in fact, in a couple of days, where we've secured 3,200 civil society signatories from around the world to call on member states to ensure that no target is considered met unless met for all. We do a huge amount of work in terms of really specific strategic policy briefings and materials. So all of those are available to anyone who would like to get up to speed. And really just use a whole variety. We try and use pretty much the whole spectrum of what could be considered advocacy. And now that we have our friends and colleagues working on Action 2015, we're able to do so much more, but through so many different channels. So we might publish opinion editorials, we might try and host decision maker dialogues at national level. So there's a whole scope of activity, and we have that already programmed in for the year that I'd love to see more members of the Save the Children family engaging with.
Helen, where can people find this information? How can they get in touch with you? How can they link into this group? Is this
Sure.
on
So,
OneNet?
yeah, it is. It is. I will make sure we've had a little bit of a lapse in terms of our coordinator for Post-2015. The position's vacant at the moment. So I'll make sure that it's all there. But certainly in terms of if you'd be interested in joining our Post-2015 group, we have calls, 90-minute calls once a month. They are scheduled twice within the same day. So one time slot that works more for Asian region colleagues, one time slot that works more for colleagues in the Americas region. And we have a really active email group and a monthly information digest. So there's a lot to engage with. The best way to do that is perhaps to send me an email. So my name's Helen Morton and my email address is h.morton, M-O-R-T-O-N, at savethechildren.org.uk. And I'd be very glad to add you to our mailing list and would really be interested in any conversations where you think we can be exploring how we can support your strategic activity at country level.
Excellent. Sorry, I misspelled Helen's last name there. I'm correcting it right now. So people can contact Helen on that email, the second one, please. And take a look at OneNet when they get their site up and running or more information. That will also be an excellent resource. Helen, this sounds like we're in a momentous time that they, really have an opportunity to change history. And there's a lot riding on this. I can imagine once these goals are in place, we're actually going to really have to reflect on our programs and how we are working with partners as well as with governments in many of our countries to help them achieve these targets and help them think about how they prioritize the resources allocated to them. Looking at implementation, what are some of the major challenges we're looking at in the implementation of the agenda? You talk about the financing for development meeting. Is it about money? Is that what we're talking about? Or is it also about aligning ministries? Is it about linkages with other global platforms, priorities? What are some of the forward-looking challenges we think we're going to have to engage in?
Yeah, absolutely, all of the above and more. I actually think the biggest challenge is that nobody's thinking about it yet. If this is something we can't even currently get heads of state to engage around the prospect of declaring this agenda in September 2015. So there's really quite limited political engagement from the highest level in terms of what delivering it and implementing it will look like. So we are concerned that it will land on the desks of ministries in key countries in every country of the world between September and January, with the expectation that from January 2016 they'll be expected to implement the agenda. In terms of the major challenges that I think we face, financing is absolutely one of them. We talk about, we heard member states just last month in the first negotiation session saying the ambition of the framework needs to be matched by the ambition of the financing, and we're really not there. We're not seeing significant amounts of money being pledged either to very specific targets or to kind of big picture finance infrastructure changes. So I think financing is a major issue. I think monitoring and accountability will also be a very significant challenge. If you think about some of the targets that are in the framework currently, very many of them aren't smart, so they're not specific, measurable, questionable in terms of their achievability. But certainly at national level and globally, we don't yet have the systems in place or the capacity or capability to be monitoring progress against a very significant number of these targets. So I think the monitoring piece is significant. And then, as you say, I think the other really important piece is probably around the planning. So if you think about your country, and you probably have a 5-year or 4-year national plan that runs through to 2020, or you may in fact have a plan that runs through to 2030. How do we make sure that this synchronizes with the post-2015 framework? How do we ensure that it is well integrated, that it doesn't feel as if it's something that has been dreamt up in New York by a group of negotiators, and really is something that's owned at national level, where, on an annual basis, but then right the way through to 2030, we can see that those communities that traditionally have been left behind are able to be making their way towards those 2030 goals. So I would say financing, is significant in terms of a challenge, monitoring significant, and then kind of how it is owned and what it looks and feels like from a national planning and ministry perspective is probably the other big challenge.
Great, thanks, Helen. That's been incredibly helpful. As we start wrapping up this webinar, I'd just like to ask you, as I ask all of my presenters, what are your top tips for people that are interested in working on this or are working on the Post-2015? Your top 3 things or 4 things that you'd like them to keep in mind as they move forward with that work?
Sure. So I would think the top 3 things are, from our perspective, it's really hugely important that we don't just focus on the declaration, but we also focus on delivering. So as you said earlier in the call, Shawnee, really when we think about the end point for this process, yes, in theory, it's September. That's when we'll see heads of state, nodding, smiling, and signing to this agenda. But really, as Save the Children and as civil society and member states, we need to be looking at the kind of end horizon as 2030. So kind of a plea from our side is not just to think about, can you tick a box and say that your thematic issue made it into the agenda, but can we also really focus on how we try and implement that? So I think in terms of a big picture top tip is to think about kind of the content, but also the implementation. The other thing I would say in order to be really successful if you're wanting to engage in the post-2015 space is to be really clear that this is a political process, and in fact it's not just a political process, it's really it's kind of a microcosm of where geopolitics are at. We haven't had a chance today to talk about what the political dynamics look like, but certainly in terms of who will win with the post-2015 framework, it's very likely that it will be the G77. The G77 is 132 countries and it spans from Brazil at one end to Benin at the other. But certainly, the reason that Brazil and India, for example, are very powerful players within the post-2015 framework, and the reason that the EU member states are enabling them and allowing that to be the case is that really this is a reflection of where global politics are at. So we're seeing a really very significant role for kind of emerging political powers. We're seeing a really strong pushback in terms of anything that looks like it might be linked to how the Millennium Development Goals were drafted, a kind of closed bunker in the basement with white middle-class, middle-aged men drafting the document. So this is really, I think, a very interesting snapshot of where global political dynamics are at. So a kind of tip from my side would be to, if you're wanting to engage with post-2015, is really to think about the kind of political implications that go far beyond that negotiating room in New York and far beyond the post-2015 framework if you're going to be effective. And then I guess lastly linked to that is really to draw on us. So, there's a community of us here at Save the Children that spend all day, every day working on post-2015. So there's a wealth of information. There's a real kind of pool of energy and expertise, both from thematic colleagues who might be leading the way for Save the Children in terms of what nutrition, for example, looks like within the post-2015 framework, and also leading what the kind of nutrition civil society response looks like, but also a huge amount of material. So in terms of a core piece of homework, if anyone wants to engage with it, I'd say our framework for the future, which was released in May of last year, is a really fantastic document. It sets out Save the Children's vision for post-2015, which is 12 goals, 50 targets, and one objective, which is to end extreme poverty in our generation. So lots of materials, lots of energy, lots of appetite, and a real desire to ensure that this is owned and implemented at country level. So count on me as your colleague in trying to advance this at country level, and really we can connect you up with colleagues right the way across the Save the Children family that see the real potential of this framework to deliver a generation-changing agreement.
Great, thanks for that, Helen. I've put in the link to our framework for the future document in there so people can take a look at that. I've also included Helen's correctly spelled email address this time, so you can contact Helen if you'd like any further information. Thank you for joining us today, Helen, and thank you for our listeners and for people that are watching this recording. For further information on Post-2015, take a look on OneNet. And for further information on the Open University Save the Children Advocacy and Campaign Training course, please do look at the Advocacy page on OneNet, and you'll find the full training course available there with all of our global initiatives, as well as a number of really interesting videos and courses that people can take and in their own time and review and see what you can both take from there, but also share your examples of effective advocacy and campaigning work that others can learn from. So thank you so much for your time today again, Helen, and everybody have a wonderful day, evening, morning.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.